you for joining us today for our Active Knox speaker series featuring Angie Schmitt. I know folks are still trickling in, but thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad you're able to. My name is Ellen Zaviska. I serve on the staff of Knoxville, Knox County Planning and the Knoxville Regional TPO, and I focus on pedestrian, bicycle, and safety planning. And today I'm really excited to be talking with Angie Schmitt. Angie is a journalist and the author of Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. You see that there on the screen, and I've got my copy right here. Chris has got his copy right there. Very good. And two of our attendees today will win a free copy. So as I mentioned, Chris is going to join us. Chris Cherry is with the UTK Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's an expert on pedestrian safety here in Tennessee. And we want to hear your questions. So feel free to drop those into the Q&A at any point today. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We're sponsored for this event by the TPO and by Active Knox. Active Knox is a partnership that includes all the sponsors you see there on the right side of the slide. Active Knox is committed to sharing innovative and proven ideas that help improve the quality of life and the economic vibrancy of our region. And this is the 15th event we've had in our speaker series. This is the third one we've been virtual. I'm so glad you're here to join us. I'm going to share just a couple of slides to get us going, and then hand it over to Angie. So if you've heard me talk about this topic at all, you've seen these slides. This is our online map we built of bicycle pedestrian crashes in our region. We've got about 10 years of data here. And I will share all these links in the chat and in a follow-up email, so you don't have to worry about where you can find all this. But we do have it online. You can zoom in on that map and see some of our high crash corridors. And this is a heat map of pedestrian crashes along Broadway in North Knoxville, for example. I get my slide to advance. There you go. We've also put together some infographics to make this data more digestible to the public and to policymakers and other folks like that. And then we've also put together these super wonky, technical, in-depth reports for each jurisdiction and for our region as a whole, looking at, where are these crashes happening, when, why, what's going on. So just a whole lot of great information. And one final slide just to talk about the trends we've got going on here. Angie's going to hit on the national trends, but this is what's going on in Tennessee with pedestrian fatalities. It's not going in the right direction. And we've gotten to the point where fully 15% of traffic deaths in the state are people walking. And it's a very rural state. That's obviously way disproportionate to how people are getting around. We don't see the same clear trend in our region. This is pedestrian fatalities in Knox County. It just kind of goes up or down a little bit every year. In the city of Knoxville, a similar trend, but we have gotten to the point where overall about 25% of the traffic fatalities in this city are pedestrians. And again, that's very disproportionate to how people are getting around. So with that, I will stop sharing my slides and let Angie pull hers up and let her, when she's ready, take it away. Thank you so much, Angie.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Let me can you see my screen pretty well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I wrote this book. It was published in August. And when I do an elevator speech about it, I say it's about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. So I've been traveling around giving virtual presentations, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that, why it's happening, and what we can do about it, and why I think we haven't done it already. So just an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, who is getting killed, where, and then I just want to warn people beforehand, there's a big section about cars, because certain things that are happening with vehicles in the United States are a part of the problem, and then I'll talk about solutions at the end. Okay, so just to go back a little bit and talk about the history of this issue, I'm using Cleveland as an example here. This is Euclid Avenue, which is sort of our downtown Main Street. And this is 1930. It's sort of, you can see there's a few cars already on the scene, but the auto era hasn't begun in full yet. We're still, it's still a streetcar and pedestrian sort of city. You can notice how many pedestrians are out on the sidewalks. The sidewalks are just jammed with people. And another thing I wanted to just point out about this is at this time, there weren't any crosswalks. So pedestrians sort of had free reign over the streets, and just notice sort of how relaxed they look crossing the street in this photo. Okay, so historically, streets had a number of uses, social uses. They were a place where children played. They were places where merchants sometimes sold things from the streets. They were sort of social places. But that all changed around this era. So there's a guy named Peter Norton, some of you may have heard of. He's a historian at the University of Virginia, and he wrote a kind of an interesting book about the politics of this era. And just to summarize real quickly, when cars first arrived in cities in a big way, again, the 30s, the 40s, especially after the invention of the Model T Ford, cars started flooding into cities. And again, these are places where children had been accustomed to playing, etc. People started getting killed. A lot of people started getting killed right away. And there was really a lot of alarm about it. And there was a lot of pushback. At the time, for example, if a pedestrian was struck and killed, the impulse was to blame the driver. And there was a lot of news headlines, the types of things that called drivers murderers, and that type of thing was the kind of temperature around the issue at that point. So in response, there was this sort of organized group of auto interests that included auto dealers and gas fuel sellers. They started advocating sort of for their interests. And one of their big victories was this introduction of this idea of jaywalking. So they introduced this idea of jaywalking, and that was really changed the way we think about what streets are for and who they're for. So, they introduced this notion pedestrians can only cross, at intersections, and even then only when there's not traffic. So, and at the time, the term jay was a very disparaging term. It's sort of like if we were to call someone a hillbilly today. So this is an example. There's this sort of like propaganda that was distributed by Boy Scouts in this case in 1952. So as you can see, this is a different street in Cleveland, but it's another downtown street. You can see this is only 16 years later, though, after that first photo, and you can see just what a huge transformation this was for cities. Now you don't see any people at all, and the entire right-of-way has been turned over to vehicles, to cars and drivers. So we've gotten to the point, long story short, that's all the history I'm going to do, really, where pedestrians have become very marginalized. And this is just an illustration that I think does a good job highlighting that. Okay, so when the pedestrian safety crisis that I'm talking about, this is what I'm talking about right here. So since about 2009, we've had about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. And that has continued for the last several years, roughly. And actually, this is very unusual in traffic safety. Generally, since about the 1970s, we've introduced a lot of life-saving technology like seat belts, airbags, anti-lock brakes. Generally, the pattern is a gradual decline. Sometimes there's a little variation. So it's really unusual to see a reversal like this. And we're not seeing the same trend in our peer nations like the UK or Canada. And we're not seeing the same trend for passengers or drivers either, but we do see it a little bit for bicyclists, something a little bit similar for bicyclists. Okay, so a little bit about who is killed. So I think that sometimes the media really does a disservice to people in their coverage of this. There's a lot of tropes that are sometimes really harmful, and sort of the knee-jerk reaction a lot of times is to blame pedestrians. Why were they in the street, basically? So I think there's sort of a stereotype about who's being killed, and in a lot of people's sort of minds and imaginations, it's sort of this guy here on the left, and he's like a very wired millennial, and he's crossing the street. Maybe he's distracted by his cell phone. He's in a crosswalk, maybe in like a major city like DC. And I think this is what a lot of people who are in positions of authority in the media and government might see anecdotally on their drive to work, right? And it might annoy them. But the reality of who's getting killed is really more like this guy over here on the right. that's just sort of sprinting across a really wide suburban arterial, in this case, without a crosswalk at that location. So this is a problem. It's a little like Corona, where you would think it would affect everyone sort of equally. But if we look closely at the data, a lot of the inequalities in our society, really come through. And racism is one of them. So systemic racism seems to have a role in this. Black people are about twice as likely to be killed as white people this way, non-Hispanic white people, and Native folks are almost 5 times as likely to be killed. So I'm going to talk more in the presentation sort of about why that is. But other groups that are marginalized are also at increased risk. Almost any way someone could be, have sort of a marginalized identity, whether they're low income or disabled, for the most part is a risk factor. So older adults are another group that's really disproportionately harmed. The risk to be killed while walking starts to rise when people are as young as 50 or older. And then by the time people are 75 and above, they're about twice as likely to be killed while walking. So I think the reasons for this are sort of obvious. Older people are a little bit slower moving usually, and they may have a harder time recovering if they're struck. But I did also want to point out, this is not a group we've done a very good job planning for. And this is also a very fast growing demographic. So, the American population is aging, and we've gotten to the point where about 1 in 4 people are 65 and above. And over the next few decades, it's supposed to rise to about 1 in 3 people. So there's groups like the Centers for Disease Control predicted as far back as about a decade ago that pedestrian deaths could rise just as a result of the aging of the American population. Okay, so that's a little bit about who's being killed. I want to talk about where also, because this is a problem that has a very strong geographic component. So Transportation for America produced this map. They do this Dangerous by Design report every 2 years that it's basically a list of the most dangerous places for pedestrians. And they have a formula they use to determine that. But the most dangerous places are shown here in purple, and the safest states are shown in green. And I think you can see there's a really clear pattern. The southeast portion of the United States is the most dangerous, almost without exception. And then some older places, or with sort of northeast, Midwest, are the safest. So why is that? So if we think back to the first 2 photos I shared of Cleveland in 1930 and 1946, some of the older cities that are safer, like a Boston, for example, was almost fully developed. It's like in Cleveland, where I live, our population might be the same or even lower than it was in 1930. So the point being, in Boston and Cleveland, maybe a lot of the city was already sort of developed, and it was developed around streetcars and sort of a pedestrian transportation system. So streets are maybe a little bit narrower, buildings are structured in a way that's more friendly to pedestrians. Whereas states like Florida and Texas, almost all the growth, Arizona, almost all the growth happened post 1940. So sort of at the height of the auto era in the United States. So these are places, Atlanta, that are really designed around the car, may have very wide, fast arterial roads that are the main transportation network, and sort of a suburban pattern of development overall. So these are really hostile places for pedestrians by and large. It looks like Tennessee did not make this list, but I would imagine Tennessee has some similar issues. So another thing I want to point out about this just real quickly is these are also the states that have captured the lion's share of the population growth in the United States over the past few decades. So some of the people are, if you look at like the fastest growing cities in the United States, almost without exception, they're in this purple band that's the most dangerous for pedestrians. So again, there's sort of a demographic trend that's bad news for this problem. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about, there's also some trends happening at the metro level that I think are relevant. And again, I'm using Cleveland as an example, but these are national trends. So this is a map that shows racial segregation in Cleveland. And this area in green is where there's segregated Black areas, Black neighborhoods. The orange shows areas that are white, that are pretty segregated white communities. And then the yellow shows areas that are a little bit more diverse. So this is 1990. We don't have the latest census data yet, or at least not mapped this way, unfortunately, but I just wanna sort of walk you through what happens over time. So we have this pattern. We're still very segregated in Cleveland, but we have a lot more diversity in our suburban areas. Down here, over here. This is a national trend, and it's more pronounced as well in growing metro areas like Atlanta, where they've seen a lot of racial change in their suburbs. But we're also seeing a lot more economic diversity in our suburbs. So we have this notion of the suburbanization of poverty. That's a important trend. And now about half of low-income people live in suburbs in the United States. So the relevance to this issue is we have more people who potentially are lower income that may rely on the bus or walking a little bit sort of out in suburban locations. Again, it might be designed after 1940, very likely, that just really weren't designed with pedestrian safety in mind at all. And so I mentioned at the beginning that this is an issue that's related somewhat to systemic racism. And just to point out here again, here's a look at our racial demographics, racial segregation patterns in Cleveland. Now here's a map of our most dangerous road segments. And as you can see, they align almost perfectly with neighborhoods of color. Again, that's not very unusual. So here's another example that I like to use. This is Portland. They produced this nice map of all the deaths that occurred in these 2 years, 2017 and 2018. And they use the first names of the victims to sort of humanize the problem, which I think is a nice touch. But as you can see, there's sort of not happening in a random pattern. There's this real clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So I just want to talk about that real quick. In Portland, there is a big geographic or socioeconomic fault line right here at East 82nd Street. So everything east of 82nd Street in Portland is East Portland. And for the purposes of this presentation, all that means is that this is a side of town that's more diverse and lower income than the rest of the city. So there seems to be a real inequality in the safety infrastructure between the two sides of the city as well. So you can see they mapped the 30 highest crash intersections in Portland. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. So in East Portland accounts for only about 25% of the population in Portland, but about 50% of the traffic deaths that happen take place there. So people who live in East Portland are about twice as likely to be killed in traffic. So here's an example sort of how I think this kind of racism can play out in our infrastructure sort of discussions. So there's this interesting study that I referenced in my book out of the University of Minnesota, and they looked at transportation issues on tribal lands and reservations across the state. So they went out and they interviewed a lot of tribal residents and elders, and they asked them, what are your top transportation related concerns? And the overwhelming response was pedestrian safety. And I think like when we look at how much more likely Native folks are to be killed while walking, I think this is one of the factors is that not only about a quarter of Native people in the United States live on reservations, but the reservations do function a little bit like a traditional village where there's a good amount of walking, but the infrastructure around it might not reflect that at all. This shot is between a food cellar and a tribal service center for this tribe in central Minnesota. So they're having to cross this very fast, high-speed road that has no accommodations for pedestrians at all. No sidewalks, no traffic lights, no crosswalks, obviously that's really dangerous. This research team, they also interviewed the people at the DOT in Minnesota, and there was this big disconnect. The DOT officials, they never brought up pedestrian safety when they were asked about it. And even if they were pressed about it, they sort of defaulted to behavioral explanations that sort of blamed the victims. So they would say something about drunk walking, for example. So, probably there was a big cultural rift there. Probably the engineers at the DOT were not native, didn't really understand sort of the situation on the ground there very well, and weren't sort of open enough to local perspectives and weren't doing enough listening. So that's just an example of how some marginalized communities could have their needs sort of overlooked. Okay, so I'm sort of shifting gears here, but just to reiterate, we do have a population in the United States that's aging. So they're a little bit more vulnerable. They're also more likely to be living in locations that are dangerous to walk in, like living in the southeast portion of the United States or living in the suburbs. And then secondly, we have this other trend where we have a big shift in our vehicle mix in the United States. So I just want to talk about, again, like I warned you about cars a little bit, because that's a big factor. So if we look back to like a decade ago, when we're coming out of the last recession, about 3/4 of new cars sold in the United States were SUVs or were sedans, were regular cars like a Honda Civic. So we've had, over the last decade, there was an enormous shift, and it happened so quickly. I think a lot of people, it took a while for people who follow these issues to even sort of catch up with what was happening. But there's been this big shift, especially with growth in SUVs and crossover SUVs. And at the latest model year, almost 3/4 of new cars sold were pickups or SUVs. And sedans have really gone out of style, and a lot of them have been discontinued. So that, it turns out, has a really big impact on pedestrian safety. I'm using myself here. I'm about a 5'6" woman for scale. But so you could see, if I was hit by this Honda Civic here on the left, I would be hit in the legs. If I'm hit by, and then the pattern would be that I would fall forward onto the front of the vehicle. Now, over here on the right this is a Toyota 4Runner. So you can see, if I'm hit by this vehicle, I'm going to be struck sort of in the abdomen or even the chest. So that's a more dangerous place to suffer a really forceful blow. And for people who are shorter, for example, children or someone in a wheelchair, or even just a shorter woman, this type of front end design may force them under the wheels. So there's really strong evidence that this is really bad for pedestrian safety. The Federal Highway Administration released a study. It was a review of a bunch of research in 2015, and they found that pedestrians that are struck by SUVs are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed than pedestrians struck by sedans. And for children, it was even worse. They were about 4 times more likely to be killed. At the same time, for certain reasons, stuff going on culturally, pickup trucks have gotten really enormous in recent years. And I'm using my son here, who was 4 at the time, for scale. But you can see the visibility issues with this big Ford F-250. These cars like this also there's been a lot of growth in this kind of vehicle, and they've also gotten bigger. And they have big visibility issues that are especially dangerous to children in the front and the back. So there's different groups. There's like a group that I quote in my book that did a study, and they were able to put like as many as 35 children sitting sort of in the blind zone of this vehicle, all totally invisible to the driver. And children are backed over a lot in the United States. Actually, about 50 children a week in the United States are backed over, most of the time by a parent or close relative, and most of the time in their own driveways. So that is a negative trend as well. Um, so I just want to walk you through sort of the evolution of one of these vehicles. It's a RAV4. It's a top selling car in the United States outside of pickup trucks. Just because I think, this happened sort of slow then fast, and it's sort of gone a little bit unnoticed. But if you look back to 1996, this was the first crossover SUV. It's basically a 1996 RAV4 is basically a modified Toyota Corolla. So this is basically sort of a tall Toyota Corolla with additional headroom. But you can see it has a very cute, like sort of puppy dog face. It's small. This is the two-door version. It starts out at 2,500 pounds. So just if we look ahead, by 2009, it's gained 800 pounds on the light end, and it has a much higher, meaner front end. And then one of the latest versions, you can see it actually hasn't added a ton of weight since 2009, but this trend of having sort of a scowling front end on the front of your car with this taller grille that's what's in style now with cars. So this has been an extremely profitable trend for the auto companies. They're able to sell like a crossover SUV, which may be based on one of their sedans for the body of one of their sedans for $10,000 to $15,000 additional. And almost all of that is profit because SUVs aren't a lot more expensive to build. So, okay. So again, shifting gears, just to reiterate, I know that's very, very much a bummer and sad. I'm gonna start talking about, what we can do about this and different strategies that places are using to address this successfully. But I just did want to reiterate a little bit again, older population living in more dangerous areas. And then thirdly, the vehicles on the roads are more dangerous to pedestrians when they're struck. Okay, so here's a successful example of a place that is trying to tackle this. In New York City, they have a Vision Zero program. They've done more than maybe any other city to reduce traffic deaths. And this is an example of a road diet. Queens Boulevard used to be known as the Boulevard of Death in New York. They had about 186 deaths between 1996 and 2014 on this road. So they're having as many as a dozen deaths a year or more on this single road. So one thing I wanted to point out about that is that's actually not that unusual. It's common in cities for one or two or a handful of streets to account for a wildly disproportionate share of deaths. And this is the kind of road that's most dangerous, wide, high speed. We call these suburban arterials. In this case, it's surrounded by a lot of high density housing. So there's a lot of people traveling around. And this is served by bus routes. Again, that's typical. So, but anyway, New York City did something about it. They in 2014, they did this road diet. They only spent $4 million, which is cheap by infrastructure standards. And they painted this, they took this lane, they painted a sidewalk on it, they did bollards. After this was completed, I believe now they have a red bus lane too on the right-hand side. But anyway, after this was completed, deaths just fell off a cliff. They went again from having as many as a dozen deaths a year to having zero for several years. And they have since had one or two, but a big improvement for very little money. So here's something else they're doing in New York that I think is worth mentioning. They're using this treatment called a pedestrian leading interval. And what that means is they're retiming their traffic signals so that pedestrians get a few seconds head start with the walk signal before the cars get the light to turn. So what this does is that it hopefully puts them out sort of in the middle of the intersection where they're a little bit more visible before cars start making these turns that, especially left turns, are really dangerous. They also are using this thing with the big yellow, you can see here, there's this big yellow arrow, hard and center line. That's what they're calling this. They just put a couple bollards in the middle of the yellow stripes there. And what that does is it forces drivers to make a sharper, slower left turn instead of, how sometimes a driver will take a really fast, wide turn and they'll cut across the opposing lane. That would sort of prevent that. So The combination of these two features is very cheap. It only costs them about $1,200 per intersection, and they've done it at thousands of intersections across New York City. So, but it's very effective. The advocates there say it's reduced pedestrian crashes on the range of about 40%. Okay. Are you guys able to chime in? Does anyone recognize these cities? Just want to give people a chance to, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to see. Oh yeah, I have access to the chat. If anyone wants to jump in and name these cities, now's your chance. I'm not 100% sure it'll work. I'll just give you one more second.
We've got some guesses. We've got someone saying Detroit, another person saying Chicago.
That's right. The person who said Detroit is correct. You win. Yeah. So this is Detroit up here on the top, and this is Cleveland where I live here on the bottom. And what I want to point out about this is just taken from space, obviously at night, but you can see Detroit is a little bit bluer in color than Cleveland at the time. So this is a big success story. At the early part of the last decade, Detroit did this survey, and they found that about 40% of their streetlights were not working for some reason. They had broken, they weren't functioning, etc. So again, they decided to do something about it. They issued $185 million in bonds, working with the state. And between 2014 and 2016, they replaced all their streetlights with LED. So that's why they look more blue than Cleveland's. So this is what's happening with pedestrian. So 75% of pedestrian deaths happen at night. So street lighting is really important. And I think it's been a little overlooked again in planning. And I think it goes back a little bit again to sort of the privilege of people in government and media who maybe are from higher income neighborhoods and can sort of just take for granted that their streetlights are going to work. But that's not the case for everyone. There can be a lot of inequality with that. So, they fixed their streetlights between 2014 and 2016. And here's what's happening with pedestrian deaths. You can see, over a 2-year period, they decline almost 35%. So even before the project is complete, we're seeing this big decline. And I know this graph's a little hard to read, but this portion here at the top shows deaths that occur in dark, unlighted conditions here in blue. So you can see they're having as many as 25 or 26 a year in Detroit in 2013, 2014. By the time 2017 rolls around, these are all fixed and in place. They're down to just one. So those kind of deaths were almost eliminated. So that's a big success story. Here's another thing I like that they're doing in Detroit. That this is a really inexpensive safety measure. They're adding 4,500 speed bumps. Only $12 million for that. Controlling speed is very important to traffic safety overall, because when someone is hit by a car, whether they're in a car, on a bike, whether they're walking, the force of the blow rises with speed, and it's not linear. It actually increases pretty quickly. So if we can reduce speeds even a little bit, we can save people's lives. So you can see this is a map, and it's showing what happens. A pedestrian who's 70 years old is almost certain to die if they're struck at 40 miles per hour. But if we can keep it around 25 miles per hour, then we're in a range where almost everyone will live. So controlling speeds is very important. I want to give Detroit a little bit of credit for that. Okay, so this is my last slide. I'm wrapping up. But I use this sort of as an example. This is a pedestrian refuge island. I don't think it's a very sexy feature. Like, we've probably all seen these before. They're not very expensive. They cost just a few $1,000s in some cases to install. This is a nice one. It's landscaped and it's accessible, but this is something the Federal Highway Administration recommends as well. Says they reduce pedestrian crashes about 35%. And it's not really very controversial either. Like, it's not like a bike lane that takes space away from cars that a lot of times can devolve into a lot of shouting matches and that kind of thing. So this is the kind of infrastructure we need to add. We need to go back into our infrastructure and add all sorts of little elements to make them safe and comfortable for people to walk in. And, it really depends a lot on the local conditions, what exactly is needed. But things like, obviously we need things like sidewalks. We need things like curb ramps. We need streetlights, like I mentioned. Bus shelters, in some cases, can be important. A lot of those just basic safety amenities that, as a driver, we would sort of expect to be in place are missing for pedestrians. And I think one of the reasons this has been overlooked, again, back to this issue of privilege, I think a lot of people who are in more influential positions just don't find themselves in the position of, waiting for a bus next to a 7-lane arterial road in Florida, and so aren't very sympathetic to people who are in that position. So anyway, like I said, I don't think we lack sort of the design tools, but what we've sort of lacked is, a recognition that this is a problem, sort of urgency and political will. So that's one of the reasons I tried why I've been traveling around talking about it, and why I wrote the book, to try and elevate it, because I think, if the will was there, we could resolve this problem. And just real quickly, last thing, if you want to buy my book, I know they're giving out a couple, but just in case, a little plug for it, you can pick it up through the publisher, and you can get a discount if you use my last name, Schmitt, as a discount code. Cool. And I think we're going to do question and answer now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Angie. That was great. And I am going to keep an eye on the Q&A as I start asking some questions. Chris, do you want to say anything in response before we start getting into the questions?
Yeah, sure. I shared with Angie and Ellen today, we are doing a Tennessee DOT safety project related to the pedestrian safety problem in the state. Ellen was generous, I think, by showing that graph and not going back any further, because this trend has gone from double digits to triple digits and stayed there for the last 10 years or so. And as recently as 2012, there were only 60 something deaths on the roadway, and now there's 170 something. So our effort is trying to find out what's causing this, and it's not a single easy solution. And I think that's one of the challenges for the state, for policymakers, for people who care, right? And so we dug into some of the same trends that Angie has pointed out in the media over the years, including in her new book, and have found some basically similar things that point a lot of the challenges towards DOTs and the way we are. I say this to every TDOT person who will hear me, is we're building the roads today, right now, they're in design, that are responsible for this scourge of pedestrian deaths. Okay, it's not that this is legacy infrastructure. And I tell my students, I have senior design students that are going through, they're defending their sort of designs this week. And I say, how many people are going to die on that intersection you designed over the life of the intersection? They go, oh, I haven't really thought about that. And so this is something that structural engineers think about all the time, but transportation engineers just don't really grab that. So the point I'm trying to make is we're digging in, we're trying to find these kind of systemic things that have changed. You think about what's changed in the last decade, and Angie pointed out a lot of kind of structural changes in the way cities are suburbanizing and so on. And we're trying to find tools that TDOT can use to rethink their design. And TDOT, not only TDOT, but every urban transportation organization. One of the things I want to highlight is I think there's a despair related to, oh, well, vehicles are getting bigger. What can we do about that, right? These trucks, we're not going to influence GM or NHTSA or whoever else to change their vehicle design standards. Maybe we can. Europeans have done it. But I think that the transportation sector can respond. I mean, if we must insist on large vehicles, then they have to go slower. We've done the math. We figured out that, yes, in Tennessee, trucks are not a huge part of the pedestrian death toll yet. But as the fleet slowly, gradually turns over and the vehicles on average get bigger and bigger, it's going to be this kind of like slow kind of devolution of safety. And I think it's incumbent on transportation engineers to say, if we're going to have big let's say, dangerous vehicles on the road, dangerous not only to pedestrians, but to everybody else on the road, then we have to make our roads that much safer. We have to make them slower. You can do, like I said, you can do the math. It's physics, right? If you're going to have big, heavy vehicles, then they have to go slower to have this, even the same impacts, power, and so on. So anyways, we're doing a bunch of this work at TDOT's listening, I'd say. So is the Government Highway Safety Office, and it's up to smart engineers and planners and policymakers to figure out a way to solve the problem. I've got a question for Angie, because as I was reading yesterday more of your book, and I was involved in a Toronto City Council meeting, I was struck by the power of anecdote. Okay. And your book every chapter starts with a story, a powerful story of pedestrian safety. And this thing I was participating on had powerful stories about disability access, never mind data or facts or anything else, right? Tennessee DOT, I won't forget, a few years ago, the commissioner was moved by an accident, a crash that happened on a highway. A truck rear-ended a queue from a construction zone. So he started this big Protect the Queue program where they invested all this effort into really responding to one high-profile crash. And how do you think that media, which you, I guess, were previously part of, engineering, planning, policy, how do you merge analysts and all of that together into decision making? Because the math is compelling when you can say, spend this much and you save this many lives, but it doesn't happen. It's not happening. Look at Knoxville's budget, for example, that was just released yesterday, and how much money we spend on different things. How do you bridge that gap?
So there's a group I write about a lot in my book called Families for Safe Streets, and they're really new. They're just emerging, but I love them. I'm so impressed with them, and I'm working with them on a project right now. So it started by this woman in New York City who lost her 12-year-old son. He was hit by a truck driver, basically. So she sort of teamed up with these other people living in New York City who had lost loved ones in car crashes. And they try to tell their stories. Like Amy, the woman, Amy Cohen, I write about in my book, she started going to city council meetings right away. She sort of realized, I think a lot of people who are harmed by these policies don't even realize. They think, oh, it's an act of God. Lightning struck. I got unlucky, and might not ever put together, oh, my neighborhood has been passed over for certain treatments because we're low income or whatever, or the federal government didn't pass this truck safety regulation and my daughter died as a result 3 years later. But anyway, Amy was, because they have such a strong advocacy scene in New York, was able to sort of put 2 and 2 together. And she thought, why didn't they have stronger speed control in my neighborhood? And she teamed up with these other families. They formed this group, Families for Safe Streets, and that's sort of their mission. So she started doing things like, she would go to city council meeting, print up like a little photo album of all of pictures of her son and give one to every city council meeting before. And she started attending meetings days, a few weeks after her son died. So she's giving tearful testimony where she's crying, her whole family, they're beside themselves. And that group, I think, they've moved the needle a lot in New York, and they've founded different chapters around the country. I don't know if there's one in Tennessee yet or not, but they were in 10 different states now. And I was just in California. So it's weird because we have like such different political climates state to state. But I just got to give testimony in California before the State House Transportation Committee. And they're doing, California is really going after this kind of thing. They're adding, they had a pilot for speed cameras, and they're doing a lot of very progressive things. And they had those folks, they have 2 chapters there of Families for Safe Streets, calling in to the committee as they're considering it. My son, my grandma, et cetera, I was injured or killed here. So So we have a long way to go. But in California, I was so impressed with what they're doing. And there wasn't even really any pushback or debate about it. Everyone on the committee seemed to get like, traffic deaths are preventable. We've got to do something about this. There's a lot of legwork that went into that. There's 4 or 5 different groups in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles that have been, that's their work, is educating people, building support for these policies. So I've seen it sort of come together in a few of these other cities, but it's very uneven. And in a lot of cases, like the cities that might really need it the most, like a Houston or a Dallas, they have a much weaker sort of advocacy scene there. And there's fewer people that use transit there. So it's harder to reach people like that. So there really is this unevenness. I do think that's a good point, that we have to be telling these stories. And I think that the work that they've done, just organizing the people who really been harmed the most by these policies, and bringing them sort of to the front in these kind of discussions, is really important.
Thanks, Chris, for that question. I'm sorry, you were muted there. I'll
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we do thankfully have a good advocacy group here called Bike Walk Knoxville, and I know that they're actually putting together a video series highlighting people who've been injured in traffic while walking and cycling, or the survivors of people who've been killed. So I'm really excited to be able to share those videos when they have them done. And speaking of the DOT, we had a question from one of our DOT staffers who's with us. Ian is asking,
I saw that.
Yeah.
Can I stop you for 1 second? I do want to answer that question.
Of course.
So like, I think, so anyway, I've been working on this issue for about 10 years, a little more than 10 years. And when we first started saying this stuff, like at Streets Blog, we're out in New York City, which of course is very different than the rest of the country. And the kind of stuff we were saying was like totally radical, sometimes I felt like the sheep in saying it, the kind of things we were saying. And over 10 years, I've just watched, and now we've gotten to the point where I tune into California, which is the biggest state in the country. I tune in and I'm like, wow, these guys are there. So things can change quickly. I do think like this work, and it's probably in much earlier stages, sort of in Tennessee, and who knows how, but things can change quickly. We can evolve. We evolve as a society on the way we view certain issues. And there's a lot of potential for evolution here, potentially too. So I know it feels like sort of a staggering thing, but I've sort of witnessed just in my career, which has been like 10 years, really a lot of change. And with this, to go to Ian's question, who asked, he's asking about, well, now we have this new administration in Washington. Pete Buttigieg is in charge of US DOT now. Biden has this big infrastructure plan he was on television last night talking about. So again, that's the kind of thing where, so for years, all through the Obama administration, all through the Trump administration, I'm writing about federal policies saying, this is what we should be doing. We shouldn't just be building highway after highway sort of thoughtlessly, because we've already kind of built the interstate highway system. Our highway system is sort of complete, we're not, it isn't the 1950s where a lot of major cities aren't connected anymore. We have connected almost every place that's worth connecting by highway. So we need to shift, I think. The focus should be more on helping people get 15 minutes to the store on foot or wheelchair, because that's what's really missing now. Too many people don't have that option. So, but anyway, Biden, they put a very progressive team in at US DOT, and the infrastructure plan calls for many of the same things, like activists like me, people at Streets Blog and different R-aligned groups have been calling for like a decade. So, and one of the things so I think there's a potential for US DOT is a little limited in what they can do unilaterally. States really have a lot of power over our transportation system, but what they've proposed is really a lot in line with, moving towards a greener, more sustainable, more equitable transportation system that would be less reliant on cars. And one of the things they proposed in the infrastructure plan is $20 billion for biking and walking. So that's over 8 years. So it adds up to about $2.5 billion additional a year to support biking and walking nationally. But it's That's compared to we were only spending about 800 million a year federally prior to that. So it's a big increase and could definitely, I think like it would make a noticeable change if it passes. And they also have additional tools that they're looking at with USDOT, like they might overhaul we're I'm working on a campaign where we're pressing them to overhaul the manual on uniform traffic control devices, which is the standard engineering manual that engineers all over the country use to design streets. And it sort of dictates where you can put a crosswalk, that kind of thing. So we're pressing them also to kind of overhaul that for safety. And that's the kind of thing that could have a big impact nationally also.
Great, thank you so much, Angie. I've got another question queued up that I've been thinking about. One of the things you talk about in the book are the different safety standards for cars and how they're primarily focused on the safety of the people inside cars rather than people who might interact with the cars outside. Is that, and how in other countries, you know, like Western European countries do have safety standards for cars in terms of how they physically impact with a human body outside the vehicle. Do you see any movement from this administration on changing that?
So it's like, probably. First of all, probably they will. There's this thing called NCAP. That's the vehicle rating system, the vehicle safety rating system we use in the United States. So if you see a car that has a 5-star rating, that's what it's from. These crash tests they do, NCAP, it's called. So, but they have never rated cars for pedestrian impacts like they do in Europe. So that's one thing I see as sort of low-hanging fruit. I am pretty confident that they're going to overhaul the NCAP system. It needs to be overhauled in a lot of different ways, and they'll add pedestrian impacts. So a car would get a 5-star. That's just the minimum. It doesn't even make cars any safer. It doesn't require cars to be any safer, but it does require them to disclose if they're really unsafe. But also NCAP, they give almost every car 4 or 5 stars. So it's actually doesn't really do a very good job educating people about. So hopefully that'll get overhauled too. So I do think they'll probably do that, which is good. It's a good start. But there's a lot of other low-hanging fruit too. Like Chris mentioned, you know, we have these big trucks. Maybe we're not going to pressure GM. They make so much money off it. Maybe we're not going to, I think they should be pressured a little bit. And there was pressure about, you know, the rise of SUVs. There was pressure from environmentalists and that kind of thing in the early 2000s. And that's sort of gone away. But even if they don't change the body, even if they don't make trucks smaller and they don't change the front ends, they could be required to have, there's different technologies now that are available, like automatic emergency braking. So that just, before a car hits something, it automatically brakes. That has a lot of safety benefits, but the federal government hasn't required it for all cars. So the federal government could require something like that for these cars that we know have these safety liabilities, like big trucks or pedestrian. There's another technology called automatic pedestrian detection. So the federal government could require, okay, if you're going to drive a truck that's 3 times more likely to kill a pedestrian, okay, but you have to have these sensors in it, that this pedestrian detection system that can, even if you can't see a pedestrian because your car is so huge, it could sense the pedestrian and stop, you know, force the car to brake. I don't see why they couldn't at least be pressured to do that.
Okay, great. So I've got another question teed up. I'll encourage anyone who wants to ask to drop some into the Q&A or the chat. You discuss also in the book the origins of the Vision Zero movement, which came out of Sweden and has moved to several dozen US cities now, which you mentioned it a little bit in the presentation, of course, calls for road designers to move from a mentality of, you know, balancing safety with convenience and other amenities to really foregrounding safety above all else in our transportation system. What do you see as the keys to making that shift in US cities?
That's sort of a good question.
Sorry if that's too big.
I interviewed an expert, like sort of for for the conclusion of my book, who said we should just be designing slow streets. All the urban streets should be slow streets. And what he meant by that was streets where the design makes it sort of impossible or very difficult to speed. Using things like bump outs, like they in Sweden, they'll narrow the intersection a lot where the crosswalk is, and maybe they raise the crosswalk too. So there's a elevation change for the driver, things like that. That would be sort of a slam dunk, I think, in terms of like, I know that it's a little bit controversial politically, but in terms of the actual outcomes, I don't really think it would slow journeys very much by car, and it would improve safety so much. It was just sort of a bad bargain we make, like, to save a minute or something, we take the chance that one of our family members is going to be killed or seriously injured. So I don't know. We do need to change the way we're doing engineering, definitely. And the road designs, I think, are sort of the top thing.
Thanks, Angie. We just had a question pop in from Bruce. Any statistics relating to distracted pedestrians? For example, people who are using cell phones, and how that relates to traffic crashes.
Yeah, so I talk about that in my book. There's really not very much evidence that distracted pedestrians are a big factor. It's sort of harder to say how big of a factor driver distraction is. Driver distraction probably is contributing to some extent, because we know that drivers drive distracted a lot and that it's pretty dangerous. Pedestrians, here's why. Here's why I would say, here's why we sort of know pedestrian distraction doesn't seem to be a big factor. It could be, and I'm not ruling out that it does have some impact, but it's definitely not the 50% increase thing. So 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night, which someone could still be on a cell phone distracted at night, of course, but also the groups that are most likely to be killed are not typically like the wired type people. Older folks increasingly, and low-income people. In a lot of cities, like I know in Nashville, almost a third of pedestrians that are killed are homeless. So low-income folks, again, at increased risk. They're also most likely to be struck outside of crosswalks. And it's not as simple as most of them are jaywalking, because people are struck in all these different situations outside of those two binary crosswalk mid-block. But they were struck more often and killed outside of crosswalks. So again, if someone's running sort of across, they're less likely to be distracted. Those kind of things. That's sort of why it doesn't seem to be a big factor. And there's some other research that backs that up as well.
Angie, jumping back to the question of design and how we need to redesign our roads, and you talked about some of these, you might say, tactical urbanism types of approaches, and I'm trying to bring it home to Knoxville. We have a budget, and the budget is every city has a budget that has a shell game. They're trading funding from one side to the other and everything else. But how do you transform a city from the size of Knoxville up to New York City quickly enough to make a dent in these trends? Have you seen it done well in some cities? Let's not talk about New York City because half the people in the state would roll their eyes and say that's not us, right? But normal cities that represent many cities in America, who's done it right, and how have they done it? How have they, whether it's political will or just you doing more with less or whatever else?
So actually, we really don't have a city where we can say this is the model. Even if we were to use like New York and San Francisco as examples. And I do think like there's New York has done a lot of interesting stuff. And one reason it's hard not to mention New York is New York has like 9 million people that live there. So they have a big budget. So they have a lot of agent, like where I live in Cleveland, there's only 2 people that do all our transportation stuff. They don't really have like the capacity to experiment very much. although we could invest more. So, one city I think that is sort of a good example, like I highlighted in my presentation, is Detroit. Like what they're doing with trying to add 4,500 speed humps, that can have a big impact, and it's relatively inexpensive, and it's sort of they're using these. It's sort of idiot proof too. I think that the kind of speed humps they're using can be moved, so it makes it easy to experiment with. So I think Detroit has actually done a lot with trying to add. They have very wide roads. They're sort of an outlier for being a northern city for being more dangerous, and they have a very low income population. So they've done a lot with trying to do some road diets too, and add bike lanes in certain places where the roads have excess width and that kind of thing. So I think Detroit is sort of promising, but a lot of cities are trying different things and sort of in different stages. And I think also a lot of cities are facing these headwinds too. Like could New York City, New York City got down in 2018 to the lowest number of traffic deaths it's had in 100 years. So pretty much since the introduction of cars, they had never, and they've reduced their traffic fatalities by about half since the 1990s. So they were seeing some real progress, but it's reversed a little bit in the last few years. Again, these headwinds, like the weird stuff going on with the pandemic, there's a lot more speeding because there's not as much traffic. Cars are getting bigger, that affects them too. So the city governments, I think a lot of them are, they're at least singing the right tune now. And I think a lot of people in the cities would object to whether they're doing enough. But I do think they need better federal and state partners as well for us to really address this problem with the scale of resources we need. So I am a little bit hopeful about what's happening at USDOT. That should be helpful, but also states. We do need states to step up as well. And some states are starting to show some leadership on this also. I don't know if that's a good answer, but.
No, I think it is. And Ian, who's with the DOT, popped up in the chat again to say, the states recognize it, and they also need to hear from advocates who want to push it, because of course, planners and engineers report to elected officials and other appointed folks. So it takes kind of all of us pushing on this. And we've reached the hour mark. So I want to wrap it up. Folks can stick around a little bit to chat, but I know a lot of people have to get back to work. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Especially I want to thank Angie and Chris for sharing their insights.